Hi, my name is Kathleen Hamilton, and I am the author of Terralepus and the book series. And today I'll be reading from Terralepus, Greg's Joy, illustrated by Brian A. Beecroft. Mary quickly ran over to the vehicle with Thomas close behind her. She jumped inside and flipped the switch, intending on disrupting the police by pulling in their cars. Instead, she watched as Thomas slammed against the magnet, followed by Lily, Sam, Cora, and Trixie. Mary stared out the window for a moment before stepping out of her vehicle. There, pinned up against the magnet, the teens groaned and glowed. Sheldon ran over and jumped into the vehicle to flip the switch, and Mary watched as the teens dropped to the ground. Cora landed on her back and breathed hard. She grabbed at her belly and stared at the sky. "Cora, are you okay?" yelled Thomas. "Cora! I can't feel the baby move. My baby! Oh, Thomas!" Lily crawled over to her sister. "Breathe, Cora. Slow, deep breaths." Mary stared wide-eyed at Cora. She stepped back as the officers surrounded the teens in the chaos. Mary looked over at Sheldon, who was standing by the police car, now in handcuffs. Her friend was going to jail because of her. Mary quickly ran over and grabbed Sheldon by the arm, and they quickly disappeared into the gathering crowd. Mary pulled Sheldon into an alleyway and picked the lock on the handcuffs. "You're a doll, Mary," he said, as the cuffs fell to the ground. "I don't know about that," replied Mary, as they quickly walked to the end of the alleyway. "I just heard a baby. How good does that make me?" "You didn't know," he replied. Mary stopped and leaned her head against the wall. Sheldon turned her around, and she leaned against him and sobbed. "Ain't nothing right about me," she cried. "Nothing right about me either," replied Sheldon. All right, in the book, Orion the hedgehog finally dates Rose, one of the high school cheerleaders. Harvey discovers a black suit that gives him powers, and he must choose to do good with it, unlike what his father desires, power and more money. Harvey's father, Chad, becomes involved with the underworld, and Harvey attempts to stop them, only to lose his father and mother in the end. Mr. Abernathy, a high school teacher, convinces Miss Parson, another high school teacher, to go on a trip with him to the Paloota Islands, and Harvey and Lindsey decide to date. All right, I'll be reading chapter 15. Mr. Abernathy and Miss Parson looked up at the tall flower of the corpse plant. Its purple petals were closed tight as it stood 10 feet tall. "Wow, that is the most bizarre flower I've ever seen," muttered Mr. Abernathy. "They say this flower could weigh as much as 170 pounds," replied Miss Parson, almost in a whisper. "It produces no root, no leaves, and no stem. Only the flower can be seen, as the rest of the plant exists as a filament within its host planet, a tetrastigma vine that can be found in rainforest." "Wait a minute," said Mr. Abernathy. "The guide said the sun always shines and the water waves back. How can there be a rainforest here?" "This island is pretty big for one, and second, there's plenty of vegetation on the island, so it must rain enough." Mr. Abernathy turned his head and looked at her. "I suppose so." The two of them slowly walked into the next room, where they saw pictures of its last bloom hanging on a wall. They continued walking as they looked up until they reached the souvenir store. "I suppose this island has a ton of souvenirs," whispered Mr. Abernathy, as he picked up and fingered a keychain with a blooming corpse plant on the end of it. "Well, I want something to remind me of this trip," she replied back quietly. "It's such a beautiful place. Too bad we couldn't see more of it." "You see plenty of it from behind the hotel," said Mr. Abernathy. "I know, William, but the plant life and the animals are exotic, and I'm afraid I won't get to see as much from the beach." Miss Parson sighed. She picked up a keychain and headed over to the cash register. Mr. Abernathy followed Miss Parson. As she paid for the keychain, he looked out the window and noticed a storm cloud rolling in. "Looks like a rainstorm," he casually said. "Oh, there goes my beach time," she replied. They headed outside and watched as the clouds gathered. There in the water were several surfers riding the waves before the storm reached the island. The wind started to pick up and Miss Parson grabbed her hat with her paw. "We'd better get inside before it pours," Mr. Abernathy replied as he watched the downpour of rain in the distance. A flash of light lit up the sky in the distance as they stood there. The surfers finally headed out of the water as Mr. Abernathy and Miss Parson headed toward their hotel. A sudden gust of wind blew Miss Parson's hat off her head, and she went running after it. "Jessica," called Mr. Abernathy as he broke out in a run after her. The hat landed on the ground and Miss Parson made a grab for it, but not before another gust of wind picked it up and carried it near the trees. She made a diving leap for it, but missed. The hat floated into the jungle. "Oh no," she muttered. She stopped and looked around. Everything seemed quiet and unassuming. Nothing seemed threatening at all. "Jessica," said Mr. Abernathy, catching up with her, "you can't go in there." "I know," she replied, "but look, there's my hat lying over there, and I'd probably be safe enough to get it." Mr. Abernathy sighed. "I suppose it is okay." Miss Parson walked over to the tree where her hat sat near it. She picked up her hat and turned back around, only to stop. There Mr. Abernathy stood, pointing at her, his face twisted in fear, as he slowly approached her. "What is it, William?" she said in a whisper, as another gust of wind blew. She watched as his eyes rose up to look at something over her head. She looked up to see a gigantic spider swinging overhead. When the wind died down, the spider swung back over her head and quickly descended. "Ah!" yelled Miss Parson as she ran toward Mr. Abernathy. He grabbed her paw and they started to run. The spider jumped over the two and landed in front of them. It raised its first two legs and held its ground. Mr. Abernathy and Miss Parson skidded to a stop and quickly turned and headed back into the jungle. They ran for a few minutes until they slowed down and looked back. The spider was now long gone. "William," said Miss Parson, "we need to get out of here. The storm is practically on top of us." "Okay," he replied. He looked around at his surroundings. "We should walk back this way." The two of them headed back as the rain started to fall. After a while, Mr. Abernathy became concerned. "I'm starting to think that this is not the way at all." "Oh, don't tell me that," replied Miss Parson. "Well, I don't recognize that rock formation over there," he said. The land seemed to slope in a different direction. The two of them stood there in the pouring rain as they looked around. They headed in another direction and wandered around. After a few hours, Miss Parson sat down on a rock under some large leaves. Mr. Abernathy sat down next to her. "I wish I had never chased that hat into the jungle," said Miss Parson. "I wish you hadn't either," replied Mr. Abernathy. "What if we never get out? Do we become primitive and eat off the land, or do we just starve to death?" "William, that's no consolation for us," replied Miss Parson. "Well, just think about it," said Mr. Abernathy. "We're alone in the company of wild animals. We don't know what could eat us, like that ferocious spider out there." Miss Parson snorted as she held back a laugh. Mr. Abernathy stood up. "I'm serious, Jessica. We don't know what will happen to us out here." "Oh, William, so far the only thing that has happened to us is we've been drenched by the rain. How dangerous is that?" She paused to listen for his response, but heard none. She turned her head and he was gone. "William, where are you?" A sudden movement caused her to look up and see most of Mr. Abernathy hanging out of a gigantic Venus flytrap. His paws were grabbing the top of the plant as the plant had clamped down on his head. His feet swung under him as he struggled to free himself. "William!" screamed Miss Parson. She grabbed hold of his leg and pulled, but the plant would not let go. She grabbed the big thick stem, but another Venus flytrap snapped at her as she narrowly missed being caught. She looked up at the multitude of traps that swayed above her and panicked. She dug into her pocket and grabbed her keychain, pulling it out and looking at it. The shape of the keychain had one sharp edge on it, and she leaped toward the stem of the plant and sliced away. Over and over she went until the trap that held Mr. Abernathy fell. Miss Parson quickly ran over and pried the trap off of his head, only to see that he had passed out. She pulled him away from the plant before leaning over him. "William," she called. Miss Parson noticed that he wasn't breathing, so she leaned over and gave him a puff of air. His chest rose up and down before she gave him another. Mr. Abernathy's eyes fluttered open as he inhaled. He looked up at Miss Parson's worried face. "Hey," he said to her, as he lay on the muddy ground. The rain continued to pour, and he sat up a moment later. Miss Parson leaned over and gave him a hug. "I was scared, William," she said quietly. "I thought you were dead." "So did I," he replied. "Thank you for saving me." He looked at her for a moment before he stood up. They started to walk once again. After a while, Mr. Abernathy pointed. "That looks like a cave. We could take shelter there." They quickly headed over, and he looked inside the small cave. When he saw nothing, they entered in and started to wring out their clothes. "So what do we do now?" asked Miss Parson. "We wait and hope that the rain lightens up so we could try to head back to the hotel," he replied. Mr. Abernathy pulled Miss Parson over, and she sat down next to him. "I wish I could start a fire, but we'll have to keep each other warm this way." He pulled her close to his side as they stared out at the falling rain. Miss Parson smiled to herself. It was already a warm environment, probably 70 degrees or so, she thought. But she wasn't going to tell him that. The two of them watched the rain as it poured down. "How did you become interested in chemistry?" asked Miss Parson, as she turned and looked at him. Mr. Abernathy leaned his head against the wall. "My interest started in middle school. I loved science. Everything in life is scientific, you know. Cars, refrigerators, even campfires all function because of chemistry. I had to learn everything about chemistry, but I wanted to teach what I knew to others." Mr. Abernathy gently smiled at Miss Parson. "How about you? What inspired you to be a teacher?" Miss Parson was thoughtful for a moment. "I loved to learn about animal and plant life, so in college I studied and did research on how a change in our environment would affect plants and animals. But of course, by the time I graduated, I found my calling to teach. So that's what happened with me." Mr. Abernathy nodded as he looked at Miss Parson. He gazed at her for a moment before she spoke up. "What's on your mind, William?" Mr. Abernathy rolled his eyes up and looked above her head. "Well, I was thinking, what if we get stuck here forever? Then it would be just you and me living off the land, battling giant plants and bugs, and maybe I would find the courage to ask you out." Miss Parson grinned. "You'd be willing to eat grubs for the rest of your life?" "Grubs?" replied Mr. Abernathy in surprise. "I'm sure there must be more here than grubs." "You wouldn't like how any of it would taste," she replied. "Would you?" he countered. Miss Parson shook her head no and smiled. Mr. Abernathy sighed. "I guess we should find our way back to civilization, shouldn't we?" "I suppose we should," she replied. A moment passed before Miss Parson leaned into Mr. Abernathy's shoulder. He looked over at her. "Well?" she asked. "Well, what?" he replied. "Have you gathered up enough courage to ask me out yet?" Mr. Abernathy snickered. "No." Miss Parson gently bumped his shoulder again. "Now?" "No." "Now?" Mr. Abernathy grinned back as she smiled at him. "No, but maybe you shouldn't give up on me yet." "What is that supposed to mean?" Miss Parson leaned her head back against the wall as she continued to look at him. "I'm just really scared. I don't know why." Mr. Abernathy looked out at the falling rain. "I would just invest my whole heart if I did date again, and what if it didn't work out? Do I even deserve to be happy?" "Are you kidding, William?" replied Miss Parson. "Everyone deserves to be happy, especially you." Miss Parson and Mr. Abernathy grew silent as they stared at each other. Slowly, Mr. Abernathy leaned in and kissed Miss Parson. They hugged and held each other until they noticed that the rain had slowed down considerably. Mr. Abernathy stood up and peeked out from the cave. The rain had now stopped, but he could hear the sound of rushing water. "Jessica, come here," he called. Miss Parson stood by him as she listened carefully. They both stepped out and looked around until they headed up a small hill. There, across from them, was the waterfall, spilling over the edge into the river below. A small rainbow seemed to jut out from the mist of the waterfall below. "Oh, William, this is beautiful," she replied, as she wrapped her arms around his waist. "Yes, it is," he replied, as he looked toward the sun setting in the west. The sun. It had always set behind the hotel. He looked back towards the jungle. "I hate to do this to you, but we need to start walking back this way." "Are you sure?" "Yes," he replied, grabbing her paw. "Let's go." The two of them started walking back towards the east as he kept looking behind to make sure they were heading in the right direction. Soon the sun was setting, and Mr. Abernathy noticed Miss Parson starting to slow down. "I'm so sorry, William," she cried. "I'm really exhausted." Mr. Abernathy picked her up and carried her. By now it was dark, but the light of the moon shone down and lit the forest floor. He stopped and looked up at the sky. The stars twinkled, and he stared until he recognized a cluster of stars to his right. Those stars, he thought, were directly outside of the hotel room window. Mr. Abernathy turned and walked, continually keeping the stars in his sight. A light shone up ahead, and Mr. Abernathy got excited. "A light is good," he thought. The light grew as he walked closer, and suddenly he found himself stepping out of the jungle and looking straight ahead at the hotel. "Ha ha!" laughed Mr. Abernathy. "We made it!" He set Miss Parson down, and they headed into the hotel and to their room. As they walked in, they both stopped in front of the mirror that hung from the wall. Their mud-covered soaked clothes hung from their bodies, and their wet hair clung to their heads. But the strangest thing Mr. Abernathy saw was his head. It was puffy and swollen. "Jessica, have I been that way the whole time? Look at my face." "Yes, you have," she replied. She kissed him on the cheek before heading to her dresser and pulling out fresh clothes. Miss Parson headed to the bathroom. "William, do you want to just order our food and have it sent up?" "Sure, that's a great idea," he replied, as he pulled off a wet shoe. "I'm beat." He pulled off his other wet shoe as he thought to himself. He was comfortable around her in the cave, and his heart had practically beaten out of his chest when he kissed her. What did he have to lose by dating her? Nothing, he thought. Mr. Abernathy dumped his wet shirt on top of his shoes and socks. The chill of the air hit him, and he slightly shivered. He picked up the phone and called for dinner to be brought up to them. The sound of the shower stopping drew his attention. He opened the drawer and pulled out some fresh clothes. When Miss Parson finally stepped out, she was smiling in relief. "It feels so good to be clean again," she replied, as she tied her bathrobe off. Mr. Abernathy headed into the bathroom and soon felt clean himself. By the time he exited the bathroom, Miss Parson had set the food on the small table. She had waited for him to join her before they started to eat. This is good," said Mr. Abernathy, as he chewed his food. "Sure beats grubs." Miss Parson giggled as they ate. When they had finished, they sat on the couch to watch the television. Mr. Abernathy put his arm around her and leaned his head in as she switched the channels. His eyelids soon grew heavy. "Jessica, I'm tired," he muttered. Miss Parson looked at him and smiled. She cut the television off and kissed him before he lay down on the couch and cuddled with his pillow. She pulled the blanket up over him, and he smiled as he drifted off to sleep. Miss Parson crawled into bed and pulled the covers up. As tired as she was, her excitement kept her awake for a few moments as she thought about her misadventure in the jungle with him, as well as the kiss. Miss Parson smiled as she dozed off. All right, well, this book, Terralepus Greg's Joy, is available at Amazon.com, and if you want to go to my website, www.terralepus.com, you can check out all the books there. And Terralepus is also available on Facebook. And if you want to see any more of my pictures, you can go to Type B Comics on Facebook. It's also in here. And anyway, I will see you later and see you in the stars.